welcome. And, I think it's always healthy for us to remember that we sometimes think I'm coming to a meeting, I'm coming to learn, but ultimately, I hope that deep in our hearts we'll realize, no, I'm coming to meet with God. I'm really coming because I believe that there is a creator of everything, including myself, including the world, who understands it and invites me into the fullness of that reality and the fullness of his love, and is in the midst of transforming it and can make sense out of my life and place it right and lead it well. And that's the desire of our hearts. And Jesus is the one who teaches us that. And one of the things that I think should stand out as we look at the life of Jesus is that if we were to consider what is it that Jesus confronts in this world more than anything else, or equal with anything else, in terms of what it is that has to be confronted in order for us to have true relationship with God, we might think of a number of things. We might think greed and lust and injustice and many things, but I would suggest to you the one thing you find him confronting most is religion. That if you look at him, he is constantly confronting religion. Now, I know that we can use the word religion in different ways, and the word religion can be referring to what is true and good and divine, but in many respects, religion is the human form of trying to relate to God and what we bring to it that is very contrived. In fact, I think what Jesus confronts is the way in which our religion as a human enterprise, a human endeavor, is really often becoming our way of thinking that we're relating to God, trying to form a way of saying we worship God, that he is the one we honor, when in truth we remain the center and in control of everything. That's what Jesus is confronting. And so we see Jesus constantly coming and confronting that in the religious leaders. That's where most of his confrontation takes place. But he's not trying to confront them as the religious leaders just because they were somehow more contrived or messed up. They had just been the ones leading a system, but that system of religion was something that can run through all of us. We've refined it in all sorts of our ways. Even Christianity, if you will, can have all sorts of forms of the same insidious stuff in the way that we try to come and relate to God. Just like then, they had an idea that religion is best kept in a compartment, best kept in like a sphere that we call the religious sphere. That never went over well with Jesus, and we do it today, right? We have all sorts of ideas how, religion can have its place as long as it stays in a nice, comfortable, respectful place. Keep it in its rightful place. We have ways in which we can speak about God, but the way we speak about God acts as if and presumes that somehow we're the ones talking about him. We make him the subject and the object by which we talk about and define and contain and control with our own language. We try to contain God within our words and think that we're the center. All sorts of things can kind of get into us, and Jesus comes to call us beyond this dynamic of religion. And that's what we come to this morning as we continue in our series Encountering Jesus through the Gospel of Luke. We've been going through this since just before Christmas. Luke is one who writes one of the gospel accounts in the scriptures. He's a doctor. He's trying to pull all the facts and create a living testimony for us to engage the living Christ. And he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, so he was able to have access to kind of all these lives, bring it together so that we would encounter. And we came last week up to the point in which Jesus has now declared his public ministry and said, now this is what I've come for, to bring the kingdom of God, the reign and rule of God, breaking into this world, to take it back. And he dynamically begins to heal the sick and to demonstrate these things as he confronts evil spirits. And now we pick up at the start of chapter 5, and we see that he brings this calling where he calls us beyond religion into real relationship. And you can follow with me he begins, and the first two, what we call verses. It says, "One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge two boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and he asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat." Luke is just giving us kind of a picture of what's taking place here. The Sea of Gennesaret was more commonly known and referred to as the Sea of Galilee. It's truly ultimately a lake, a freshwater lake, and the largest within that territory. And so Jesus has come there, and the fishermen have been returning, and they've been fishing, through the night, and so it's just morning, and they're kind of cleaning their nets. But the crowds had continually sought to follow Jesus wherever he went. As we had seen, the people had begun to understand that he speaks with one who's not like any religious leader in the finite world. He speaks as one who has this authority, as if he's pulling back the curtains of heaven, of reality, of this other understanding. And he's full of this truth and this grace, and it's drawing people to him. And it's hard for us to imagine, because we live in a world so full of words, we can't imagine anything that would make us feel like that compelled, because we just have an overload. But they didn't have an overload. They were drawn that this is what I need. And they're deeply drawn to him. And so they're pressing in on him by the shoreline. So you can imagine Jesus is kind of pressed back against the water behind him, perhaps. And the people are so pressed in that there are now people standing right in front of him. And he realizes he can't really talk to this growing group of people because they wouldn't hear him behind. So he realizes, a good thing to do might be get a little bit of space so I can speak over and people would be able to fit this gathering better. So he sees the boats and he decides he'll just take one of the boats and just push off a little bit, gain that little distance, and he'll speak. So it says that he identifies one of those boats as belonging to Simon, and he gets in the boat. I like how it says he got into the boat, and then he asked Simon about it. It's like a little presumptuous, like one of those people who's like, it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. But he does that, but we might think, well, why did you just get in this guy's boat, and then you tell the guy, to cast it off for you? He doesn't know him. But the truth is, he does know Simon. Luke doesn't kind of give that away right in these words, but he had described how Simon was one of those that appears to have already been somewhat called by Jesus. I mean, Jesus had come and his brother had gotten him, and they'd come and said, wow, this may be the Messiah. So they're very drawn to Jesus. He's unlike anybody else. And just before this, as we saw last week, as Jesus had come into the area, it says he went back to Simon's house, where they found that Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a fever that could have been life-threatening, and Jesus healed her. So Peter is one who's even serving as a helper and maybe even a host for Jesus in the area. He's one who very much sees that Jesus is unlike any other religious leader, but Peter's a fisherman. Religion is kind of over there, and it's a part of his life, and he's glad to be a faithful helper to the religious thing. But there are people who that's their primary thing, and for him, he's a fisherman. That's his core identity. It's what he's grown up to be. So he is very drawn, though, that no one in the religious world has been like Jesus. But we might say that Peter's more of a fan at this point than a real follower. It's not like chasing after him or giving his whole life yet. He's more like a patron of Jesus than he is a real partner with Jesus. And Jesus is about to change that, because that's a religious idea. Jesus doesn't see religious leaders or people in the religious side of things and then somehow this other side of things. And so it is that this is all now going to begin to change as Jesus begins to press in on him. So he gets into the boat and he presses off. And it says in verse 4 and 5, Luke continues, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. So at this point, you can try to imagine that, they've been fishing where they always fish, into the late at night, before it gets light. They've been fishing all night. They haven't caught anything. They've been fishing in the shallows, because that's where the fish are. And so Jesus is saying, let's go out deeper. And that, I think, becomes an incredible metaphor for the fact that he is inviting Peter, as we'll know him later as Peter, Simon at the time, he's inviting him out into deeper waters, out past the shallows that he has lived in. And that's what he wants to do in all of our lives, is take us past the shallows of religion out into the reality of relationship with the living God. And he's inviting them there. But how it would play out in Peter's mind, if you kind of imagine this exchange, and to appreciate it, is you have Peter, who's worked hard. They've worked hard all night long. They haven't caught anything. They're what? Exhausted. Totally exhausted. And they decide, we got to clean our nets and mend them. That's hard work. It's laborious work. But if they're going to get back to fishing the next morning, they need to do this. And they're probably nearly finished. So at this point, you think he's worked hard all night long. We're really done. Jesus doesn't seem done. They're done. They're ready to go home. Jesus isn't. And I think that's a bit of a metaphor, like for us, that sometimes we think, I'm done, this is good for me. And Jesus is like, we're not there yet. We haven't really reached the place that we need to reach. And he comes specifically to Peter and engages him. And you can imagine what Peter's thinking at this point. He's thinking, you're a good carpenter in the past, but I'm a fisherman. You don't tell me about fishing. I don't know much about fishing. I just know a bit about men, and we don't like to be given directions. And that's precisely what's happening here, is he's being given directions, but it goes way beyond that. He's telling him about the core thing that he finds his natural identity and pride in. Who is Peter? Well, locally, he's been a fisherman and a good one. He's kind of the leader of this group. That's what he finds his place in, his identity in, his purpose in. I'm a fisherman, I'm good, I'm local, this is what I know. You're a rabbi, please keep it in the religious compartment. But now the religious compartment is saying, I don't operate that way. I'm now speaking into your realm. And you can imagine he's thinking, well, let's get this down. Fishing is done in the morning. It's not done now. The fish are gone. They're not here at this time of day. And by the way, they're not out in the deep. They're in the shallows. I know these things. And we just finished cleaning our nets. There's no reason for us now to, if we go back out, we're going to have to redo this all again. This doesn't make sense. And he's waiting for Jesus to go, I don't know what I was thinking, Simon. I'm sorry. But he doesn't. Jesus just looks at him. And he just lets this lingering moment where it's like, you get it, Master, right? Like, this doesn't make sense. Jesus doesn't respond. And it's like one of those DTR moments, define the relationship moments that couples have to have when they're dating. Like, do we have to define where we're at? And it's kind of like that for him. Like, you just called me Master, which meant rabbi. So what does that mean to you when I tell you we're going further? And Peter's like, okay, because you said so. And this begins to challenge him. And here we see the first thing that I think is common to all of our callings, which are personal, and it's personal for Simon, but there's some common qualities. And the first is this: Jesus' calling pierces our false source of identity and our comfortable religious compartments. The truth is, we live in a way in which a culture creates for us all these ideas about religion. And one of those, as I said, was that religion is supposed to be a nice part of your life. And as long as you keep it just that part of your life, hey, you can have a respectable religious life. Just don't bring it into everything else, right? And people love to say today, hey, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And in that sense, they're just trying to say, look, I don't do religion, but the truth is they have this whole way of doing religion. We just aren't thinking very clearly. that the truth is God, if he's God, is God of everything. He's not the God of your making. He's not the God of your compartment. But we're trying to make a God of compartments, one that we can kind of choose, select, and contain inside of our comfort zone. That is precisely what Jesus is confronting. I'm sorry, but God is not going to be the God of your comfort zone any longer. And you can feel like it presses into his own sense of, wait a minute, I'm comfortable with having my religion over here, but honestly, my identity, like where I really feel good about, like what really matters and defines me and gives me purpose, it's fishing. I'm a fisherman. And I'm cool having religion, but I'm a fisherman. That's who I am. And Jesus is completely messing with that. Not because he doesn't value that Peter's a good fisherman. I think he'd say, Peter, you have a gift of managing part of what God created, which is the seas and fishing and fish that are a provision. I love how you manage it, but it's not who you are. The gift has become your God. It's become your identity. And you are trying to separate this, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to mess with it. And for many of us, we might have to be honest and say, like, hey, I'm cool with God if he wants to save me and do religious stuff over here. I'll have that part of him. But don't mess with my role in whatever that might be. You're not really the God of that. This is where let me keep finding my sense of primary purpose, identity, and well-being and affirmation over here. Then we don't know God. Because God is not the God who's in a compartment. And that's what Peter has to begin to face, is that God wants to be the God of everything because he is the God of everything. And that's what's beginning to unfold for him. And when we realize that God is the God of all, it initially, I think, makes us feel smaller. Like, whoa, I felt really good and proud. I had this big place in the world. But when I realize you're God, I don't feel so big. And I don't feel so grand about myself. And so we might have to go through the process of feeling smaller, something we've worked hard at trying to fight. But in the end, the world gets really big. And it's about to get really big for Peter at the end of this. So Luke goes on and says, when they had done so, when they had cast off into deeper waters, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. So here we see that he set off Simon, who again, Jesus had said, I'm going to call you Peter. It's going to be like another name spiritually, which means the rock, because there's so much more of who you are. So he's even going to give him this new name. So we can refer to him at this point as Simon or Simon Peter or Peter. And you can see that he starts off with this sigh like, okay, if you say so. And there's just that point of obedience where it's like, I called you master, you've told me to do this, it doesn't make sense, I can't talk you out of it. It's almost like where he's at, kind of this resignation. We'll go. But what happens? Suddenly everything changes. And his whole religious way of relating to God is exploded. It's broken. It's collapsed. And suddenly who's he facing? God. He's now in the presence of one whose sheer goodness and sheer grace he had not been prepared for. And that's what we see as it says that he comes to this place and he and his partners are overwhelmed. They've never had a catch like this. And he realizes that, oh my, he's not the one who fits my box and my compartment. He's not the one I can contain. And it says that in that reality it scared him. And he says, get away from me. And he's not really saying that he wants God to get away from him. He's just facing the sheer reality that when you realize who God is, you will have to face yourself for who you are. And it's not a comfortable place. And in fact, probably we spend most of our unconscious energy trying to feel okay about ourselves and having this idealized self where I see myself as really a good, and I don't really have these flaws and these failures, and I'm really important, and I have these roles, and I feel great, and I know I'm not perfect, definitely, but I don't really face the full reality of how weak I am and how limited I am, and really how there's truly the reality of a sinfulness that can run through me. We just don't face that. Now, we admit we're sinners, but we only mean it like generic sinners, not like real sinners. And as long as you're a generic sinner, you only have a generic God. See, God can't love you as this ideal self because it doesn't actually exist. And most of the time, we're trying to kind of still be a little idealized and find our self-importance, and hey, I'm a fisherman, I rule certain things in this world. It's like, I'm sorry, Simon, you're not in control of anything. You're not even in control of the ocean or the fish or anything. You just presume you are because it makes you feel better about yourself. You feel powerful, but you're not in control of anything. And now before that, he's taken back and he realizes the nature of who he really is. And he's like, I am a sinful man. I recall one time when someone had come and when I was in younger years and challenged, just brought up some concerns for some things in my life, and they left it at that. And I walked back in, and I was sitting on this couch, and I remember this profound moment where I realized, no, I'm really sinful. Like, I've really violated God, and I really get it. And I felt it in its fullness like I never have. And in that moment, I didn't feel farther from God. I never felt closer to God. Because I felt like God was present right there. But I was sitting as one who knew. I never agreed with God more. It's like I agreed in theory, but now it's like, no, this is sin. I really am really violating something that's not right. And the reality of being a sinner made me actually closer to God because I was now fully or closer to facing his goodness, but also his grace. And I don't know what was in your mind as you came today, but I would suggest the best thing you could do when you get up and you want to come and have a time you're gathering with God is say, I'm a sinner. Because if you don't come here as a sinner, you will never meet with God. Because he is the God who is truly good and truly full of grace. And it's when you face the face of grace that you will most know who you are and you will most know how much you're loved. Tim Keller likes to say that really the gospel is that we are much more sinners than we'd like to believe, and we're much more loved than we could ever imagine. And that is the reality that Peter faces. And in that moment, all of his well-guarded religious pretense is gone. And that's what we find he comes and brings. That Jesus' calling brings the intimacy of piercing our pretentiousness as we stand before the presence of his sheer goodness and grace. And so Peter calls out to him, and not with the same word master, but with the word Lord. He says, Lord, get away from me, Lord. And he now speaks of him in the way that a religious Jew would only speak of God himself. This isn't about me letting you be some religious figure. You are now the true God who knows me and sees me like I've never been seen, and you're standing right with me. And in that moment, so much happens. C.S. Lewis says, some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. It is not entirely fun to get that honest and real. It's not fun. We have spent so much of our lives trying not to face ourselves and get real and face the absolute goodness of God. To get close to God is I have to face things. But when it happens, when we get open, when we say, I want to let God meet me in who I really am, and get real about it, we're going to find that we've never been so loved and our world never got so big. It's incredibly liberating, and that's what we find with Peter, that ultimately something good is happening here. He is transcending that religious pretense. And The experience deepens him. And Luke concludes in verse 11, then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. You don't need to get away from me. I'm right here. You can be present with me as you start to let this thing get real and permeate you. Don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. You know, I find that last statement, I've just been sitting and while I've come across it so many times over the life of following Jesus and thinking what was happening here and what he wants to do with us, I just find this one of the most powerful, one of the most dramatic and defining statements of all that we could read. They pulled their boats up to shore, they left everything and followed him. It means that following meant that they followed the road. They joined him, Jesus, in everything that he was about. That's what it means to follow. And it's so dramatic when you picture this. For one thing, it seems to indicate that they just left the biggest catch of their whole life left on the shore. Like, this is the one where they're like, oh man, we could never feel better about ourselves. I mean, look at this. We're bringing in so many fish, it's tearing the nets. We got to break. This is incredible. And they walk away from it all. It kind of adds to the drama here. It's like, whatever he's got, it's bigger than everything. And it says they left everything. And I know that as we read that, it's possible for, us to kind of think, wait, this is kind of one of those things we wonder about. If I'm serious about following Jesus or becoming more religious, does this mean somehow that I am to leave my livelihood and leave my family and my work and all of my common life? Am I to leave all that and just march off? No. And Jesus doesn't presume that upon people in general. Jesus was a rabbi who's saying, it's time for me to move out and bring this work into the world. And I'm going to do it through some disciples. 12 of them are going to be my core team of disciples. And in that rabbinic tradition, there would be a group about that size who would, for a season in their lives, leave everything and go and fully follow them and learn all their ways in order to carry those ways forward. So Jesus has got a group who's going to do that. And Simon, Peter, and his brother and the two other brothers, they're all going to be a part of that. So this group does leave in that fashion. But Jesus has many disciples, and they're not called and expected to do the same. They're not even asked to do the same. But all of them are called to follow him. He does say, follow me, but it doesn't mean leave everything. But what it does mean is everything else becomes secondary. This is defining. This breaks out of your religious compartment where you have a religious life. It is the reality of God becoming everything and defining for you. And it's so powerful. And that's why he says to him, I'm redefining you. You found your identity in fishing. And he's saying, you got something so much bigger. You're going to be fishing for men. And you can imagine, it's like, wow, is this so much bigger? And I know for some of us, when we hear that term, go be fishers for men, does that mean that we're to go out and carry on in the ways that sometimes people associate with that? And it kind of scares us because we think, to be fishers of men means I'm supposed to go out and on a street corner and yell at people about things they don't even understand. And we're kind of fearful about that. Or we think that it means, I'm supposed to go out and forward emails to people that people tell me I should forward to other people. Nowhere in the Bible does it say to do that. You do not have to forward every email as somehow some means of catching people. What Jesus is saying is, you receive my life and let it begin to be shaped in you, and then it's naturally going to be shared with other people. You're going to share your life being transformed by my presence, my grace, my forgiveness in you. That liberating call now to be joined up with God in the eternal life, and you're going to naturally share that with other people. And that's what Jesus brings them into doing, and he's inviting us to do. And it changed everything for Peter. Peter's whole identity had been, I'm a fisherman first. That's really where I find myself, and I have a religious life. And all of a sudden, Jesus says, no, your whole life is now filled with a mission, with purpose. And so the third thing that he really does is Jesus' call fills our life or defines our life or redefines our life with divine purpose. It's like everything finds its place. It permeates everything. Sometimes people will naturally maybe ask, not too often, but they might say, Brad, when did you feel this calling? Or how did you know that you were called to be a pastor? And I find that's a very secondary question for me, because when that became clear that that might be what I do in terms of the fullness of my time, that was more logistics of leading this community in the natural way that worked out. The real truth is it kind of goes back to when I first began to hear of what Jesus had done and how he was the fullness of God made real. And I said, that is unlike anything else that's ever existed. Who he is reflects something that I believe could be true. There's no one like him, and not any who have done for me or the world what he has done, to give his life, to bear in his own suffering, to be the final sacrifice that separates us from our Creator. I think this is true, and my soul's taking that in. And in the process of reflecting on that and receiving that, and of course, that's something I'm constantly in the process of, but even from early on, I remember having this sense that if this is true, it's worth giving my whole life to. If this is real, nothing really matters more. And it didn't diminish anything else in my world. I still love surfing and volleyball and friends and coffee and all sorts of good things. What it changed is that none of those were going to have to be an end in themselves, or I didn't have to find meaning in them. They were all part of the joy and the journey, but what gave purpose was to know that I was invited into the redemption of the world. And that seemed a little bigger than most of the things I was trying to find meaning in. And that's God's heart. He's not saying, hey, I want you as one of my workers to finish my project. It's more like he's the Father who says, I've invited you home, but to show you how much you really are home, you're back in the family business. And the family business, as Jesus would later say, is to seek and to save those who are lost. This world is lost. I want your heart back in my heart to now be filled with that purpose. I'm not asking you to be an obnoxious person. I'm not asking you to be a superior, self-righteous jerk. In fact, Jesus primarily is trying to get them to stop being self-righteous jerks, because most of the religious leaders were. And he's saying, I don't want to call them because they'll be self-righteous, superior jerks. That's why he didn't call them. He had to go for some fishermen who might be easier to bring beyond religion and get to relationship. And he's got Peter, and he's after you and I to do the same. I want to invite you to be filled with my purpose as those who don't find yourself self-righteous, don't think you have the better way, don't think you just simply believe the right things and that makes you a better person. I want you to be one of those who understands I'm God and begins to seriously invite my life to be in you what you could not be by yourself, and then begins to let that form and get shared with people. That's what he's inviting us into. And what we need to think and understand is that when Jesus came to this world, he saw that the greatest enemy of relationship with God was religion. Religion becomes the greatest enemy of relationship with God. And we might say, I get that. I don't like religion. I like to, say negative things about religion too. I'm not about religion. But the truth is, religiosity, or these dynamics, are really not just about the name or the word religion. They're about our way of trying to worship God when in truth we are still the center of everything. And it means that we have to, like Peter, like Simon, we have to come to a point in which our whole identity is not about, keeping God in a compartment while we find our identity in something else. It's when we say, He's really the sovereign of all. You might be great in accounting, you might be great in entertainment industry, you might be great in nonprofit industry, whatever you might be a part of, that's great, but you're not the source and sovereign of anything. You might think, oh yes, I know, in my world, no, you're not. You don't control it any more than Peter controlled fish. You just don't. And when we kind of let go of that and we realize, no, He is the source and sovereign of everything. And I don't have to succeed at this to find my identity. I'm a child of God. This is who I am. We begin to move past that compartmentalization and begin to know that God is God, not the God of our compartment, not the God of our definition. He's God. And we begin to stop speaking of God as one who we get to define and put boundaries on. But like Peter, suddenly God becomes God, the one who's defining us. And most of us, if we're honest, we think we define God. We love to have talks about God, right? Anybody if somebody says, well, tell me about God, it's like, well, let me tell you about my ideas about God. I mean, we're very proud of our ideas about God, and there's a fitting place for that. But we have to realize we're talking about the supreme creator and eternal God. He's the one defining us, and Peter's having that moment, and we do too, when we come before the sheer reality of God. And suddenly, our world doesn't get smaller, it gets bigger, infinitely bigger. And that's what Jesus does, Peter. It's what He wants to bring to us. And so it is in that sense that we do well to say, yes, we're not for religion, but we're confessing our own struggles where we want to keep God in compartments, we want to contain Him. We don't want Him to be our sole purpose, but that's what He has to bring. That's what He wants for each of us. I want to invite us to stand and to take a moment and find ourselves just being honest about our own pretense. Would you pray with me? God, I don't know how we use the word religion. You do in our lives. We use it in good ways and bad ways and lots of ways we might speak of it, but you seem to come and want to confront in us our own pride and our own desires to contain you. But you have so much more for us. And some of us here, we've not let you be God. We've tried to keep you kind of a religious figure in a religious compartment. And some of us have known you to be God, but we keep coming back to try to kind of keep it contained, safer, comfortable. But in your own heart, I just invite you just to take a moment and you, in your own honesty and what fits for you, perhaps just take a moment and confess that and invite God to be God. Jesus, we reminded that you had a difficulty with the religious systems that allowed some to, and perhaps all, to be invited to remain very self-righteous and superior, to know who is good and bad, who should be loved and who should be hated. Forgive us. Forgive us for using you as a means to serve our own ends. May we bow as Peter did and say, we're not worthy. You are so much more good and so much more gracious. May you fill us with your goodness and your grace. May you truly come, and may we truly know you as God in the ways that you make known. Let's worship together.